So Dr. Ramsey, thank you so much for being with us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, Lauren, thank you very much. Real quick, sound check. Can you hear me just fine?
Yes, we can.
All right, perfect. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the National Centers of Academic Excellence for this Tech Talk. It's such a pleasure to be with you all today, and I hope with some of the research and information I provide you, we can see how technology continues to change and grow as we move forward in our careers. First, I'd like to take a quick moment to acknowledge and say thanks to a lot of the folks who have supported me throughout a lot of my journey. First, with the University of the Cumberland, such a great group of folks there. I really appreciate their support. My team, I work as the IT director for the Porch Creek Band of Indian Tribe in Atmore, Alabama. I have a great team there who support me in all my antics. American Intercontinental University, New Mexico State University, all great places that I have worked for or work for and support me. And a special thank you to a friend of mine, Dr. Eric Martin. Dr. Martin's been a great supporter for quite some time. And so I really appreciate everyone who has supported me through this venture. All right, so let's talk a little bit about my background. I was raised in Kentucky, the great state of Kentucky, a lot of background in, with horse racing and bourbon. I won't say how much, but some, and the tobacco country as well. I have a bachelor's in math, master's in information systems and management, and a doctorate in management and leadership with an emphasis on information systems and technology. As I mentioned, I'm the IT director for Creek Indian Enterprises in Atmore, Alabama, and couldn't have made a better choice. They're quite the organization and very supportive. Over 25 years in IT and more than 20 years in the classroom, and I don't think there's anything more important than us educating our future. I don't think of myself as a professor or teacher. I think of myself more as a mentor. I want to work alongside students and faculty and staff and how we can make ourselves better and make our futures better. As a side gig, I do work as adjunct professor for the University of Cumberland, Mexico State University, and the American Intercontinental University. So I couldn't be prouder to have the support from all the universities. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about healthcare virtualization. I'm going to kind of give you a background and kind of what I've studied and kind of what brought us to this point. Several years ago, I started working for an organization that implemented and upgraded cardiovascular radiology and medical records in hospitals around the US. In fact, we had over 2,000 clients across the US and Puerto Rico. And as I began to travel, well, when I say travel, I traveled everywhere. I was in 48 states, 47 states within about a 7 to 8 year span. So it was quite a lot of traveling. But I began to recognize that a lot of the hospitals didn't really talk much about virtualizing their critical applications, like medical records or even their radiology or cardiology. And it actually caused us some concern because as we started talking to the hospitals, we recognized that some of the main concerns, no matter how we built their systems, there was lots of impact on the healthcare that patients were receiving. We've actually seen it where some physicians and surgeons had patients on the table with surgery going on, and they lose their data. They lose access to that information. And so that's, you can imagine, a scary moment. So the problem that we really started to identify is how is the availability of data related to how well patients are taken care of? And that really sparked a lot of my interest because as we continue looking at virtualization and cloud computing and cloud services, another great study that comes out of this we'll talk about a little bit later. The background or framework that I did when I study one was a qualitative research study, but I did an Edelphi study. An Edelphi study talks about a panel of experts and multiple rounds of questionnaires. It's a chance for you to really get your information from the experts in the field, and through multiple rounds of questioning these experts, you start to see themes or data emerge using various applications or statistical analysis. And so this is an outline of the Edelphi technique that I used in this study. Delphi technique, I did find the requirements, who was competent, who was going to be my experts, and then I began to do the round after round after round that I'll show you in just a few moments. Interesting enough, the Edelphi study was not very prominently used for quite a while, and in my university where I graduated from, I was one of the first researchers to actually utilize the Edelphi study and able to publish an article on the Edelphi technique and why it's such an important study. The Edelphi technique is just a Delphi technique with a survey, a random survey to various different panel of experts. So again, I'll talk about the purpose of the study. The study was, again, an Edelphi study. I was able to use SurveyMonkey, and I began to look at all the different experts and what they began to see and what they would like to see are their experiences. I began to question round after round, and after the third round, I found that I had a pretty good set of themes that started to emerge out of the study with the data. We'll talk about those in just a minute. So the first round is I really wanted to know their position. Who were those people? What are their background? Do they have any software virtualization or cloud computing knowledge? And I really didn't find a consensus. You could imagine with background information about people's positions, there was really not a lot of convergence of the data or consensus. So my second round questioned the advantages and disadvantages of software virtualization. This is where probably a lot of my experts in virtualization chimed in more than the medical physicians. So my panel actually had both physicians and surgeons and virtual and cloud computing experts. So I had really the two main areas of this study and my research on both ends of the spectrum. And then finally in round three, I questioned the current and future state of software virtualization and their experiences out of that. And this is where I began to see some really in-depth, consistent consensus emerging from the data. I gathered great data out of 1, 2, but out of 3 is where I really saw the data come together to provide information from the various panel of experts. This is, I'm not going to read through all these questions, but this is an example of the different round 1 questions I asked. What is your occupational role? You know, what is your background? As I mentioned, do you know what virtualization is? I had to have a baseline to begin testing and talking to the experts about. I wanted to know which ones were for physicians, which ones were not, and there's particular role and background in the various areas. One of the important things I also talked about is about the benefits, because I wanted to know what their ideas of cloud computing or virtualization was about. And finally, what might be the benefits of virtualization benefits to patient diagnosis process? Because if I have some information about virtualization or cloud computing, what about maybe how that relates to or possibly part of the actual organization? So like the diagnosis of patients in that process. And then round 2 is what is the occupational role? What are the disadvantages of using virtualization? So you're going to notice the initial one was, the first round was what are the advantages? The second one is the disadvantages. So I want to kind of throw them off to see if maybe they were just answering the questions to answer them. I wanted to make sure that they were really looking at the questions and providing some type of, some type of in-depth information. How do you believe virtualization can impact the patient encounter process? Again, I always wanted to see their aspect or their input, their environment and how it's actually connected, some type of relationship. And then finally, I actually asked in the final round just 2 questions. You know, if you're pitching this information to your CEO, because one of the biggest things that a lot of executives are concerned about is having all their virtual eggs in one basket. Again, through multiple types of scenarios with the way that virtualization and cloud computing can be built. Of course, we can sustain 100% uptimes in a lot of different areas. But according to a lot of the CEOs and C-level management team members that I spoke to, they still hung on to this whole effort that I'm not sure I'm going to put all my eggs in one basket. And so it was that question alone that really started to merge the consensus that the biggest concern here about this relationship was it wasn't fully just with the patient healthcare, but the concerns that the CEO and the C-level team had regarding this eggs in one basket scenario. And the final question is, where do you believe virtualization will go or is going over the next 5 to 10 years? I wanted to see how much in-depth knowledge that they had on what the future could hold or what they would like to see it hold. And so these 2 questions, I began to really get good information from, ask the right questions, and I was very impressed with this. Now, one of the things I'd like to add at this point is the type of physicians that I had on my panel or well-known physicians from some of the largest university hospitals in the country. And so these were seasoned, matured physicians, as well as a few that were very new out of medical school. So I wanted to also see if there was a differencing in opinion or ideas, depending on that generational gap, if you will, for the more seasoned physicians and the less or more young or the younger physicians that might have been participating. So as I began to analyze this, I began to look at the demographics. 17% of the expert panel were my physicians, and they were excellent. A couple of them really came from my interactions with them through the hospital visits that I was doing. And then 83% were software virtualization experts. I had a little bit of an unlevel amount. I was trying to get 50-50, but unfortunately with the number of physicians and how busy they were, I did not have as successful as a quantity, but I did have a little bit more than I was anticipating, even though I was hoping to get 50%. The first round, second and third round, you can see that the participation dropped a little bit. And I think it just had to do with the availability of the participants, really. I'm not sure which ones dropped at this point because it was completely anonymous. 100% of those participated affirmed they knew about it. So all of my panel of experts knew something about virtualization or cloud computing. 100% of those participated affirmed they worked in a hospital medical informatics environment. So that was one of the big things, is I just didn't want any medical person, or excuse me, any IT professional. I wanted some professionals that directly had jobs in the medical informatics field. And this was critical because they knew more information about the information systems management area for hospital information systems and how important it was for those medical records, cardiovascular and radiology applications. So that was one of the only really large areas that I wanted to hit on, was making sure that the IT professionals had direct hands-on functional knowledge of medical record infrastructures. And then finally, 62.5%, so less than 65% of the panel believe that software virtualization has a relationship on the patient diagnosis process. And I'm going to talk about that more in just one moment. So this is a real quick, some results of the research and the questions and themes that emerged. And according to research, virtualization software that emulates hardware, and there's a lot of themes that says there's, like number 2 says, are all these eggs in one basket. And then finally, the biggest theme is the reduction in cost in software virtualization for the hardware. So what I was hoping for is these are the 3 areas that I wanted to kind of bounce around in some ways in my questions to ensure that we keep ourselves focused and contained within the confines of the research study. These are well-known architectures, these are well-known documentation, and certainly I wanted to make sure that the responders knew that we were going to put a framework around this particular study. Results from the research study, some more themes. Round 1, availability system. So when I began to crunch the data and I began to look at the themes that came out of the common words or wordsmithing that occurred, each of the rounds provided me various different types of information. Round 1, availability, system, and virtually equally merged out of the scatter analysis. And what this means is when I started talking to the physicians and I did the surveys and with the physicians and the IT professionals, all of these items, these 3 main items, were equally distributed around 33% around each of these. And it really showed that the biggest things, even for physicians, it was availability. I want to make sure that data is always available for me, no matter what the situation. And I began to question some other aspects of that to figure out that a lot of the C-level leadership team members, they really have a lot of concerns when it comes to the availability of data and putting that data in the cloud. And so, of course, cloud computing is virtualization, whereas you can have virtualization on site as well. But again, it goes back to that all eggs in one basket approach with a lot of the way the architectures are built. The system availability, data availability, and virtual are all the emerging themes that came out of round 1. Again, I didn't really find anything in round 1 really striking. I kind of had an idea that availability was going to be a big part of that. Round 2, disadvantages noted. single node failure, complexity of the implementation, incomplete processes and procedures. I was surprised by this when I started to see the merge of incomplete processes and procedures. And I'm speaking from my own IT experience and my leadership of multiple teams. IT professionals, we tend to love diving in and doing a lot of neat things, but we forget about documentation. In fact, we can be the worst types of people to do documentation. And so incomplete processes and procedures can be a big gap in any type of infrastructure, and it could result in data availability and other concerns. Some other things that came out of this was requires a specialized knowledge to support. It absolutely does. You don't just take VMware or Microsoft Hyper-V out of the box and begin implementing it. You've got to have the knowledge and the understanding and the backing in order for that to work as successfully as you want it. Could you get it up and running? Sure. It's going to take you some information, maybe a YouTube video or some contacting of support, but to really utilize it the level like we were expecting at the hospitals, you need to have really fully trained, certified professionals who can deal with that. And also a misunderstanding or inadequate knowledge can cause interruption of services. And again, this related to the infrastructure. A lot of the physicians were concerned about the fact that if we implement this, who is going to support it? And the C-levels got involved and said, well, if I have to have more experienced, more certified individuals, what does that do for the cost of my personnel, right? So they have to weigh that because IT is a fully overhead shop anyway. So what does that do with our overall cost? And then finally, round three found out it reduces administration, ease of availability of servers, reduction of hardware costs. Reduction of hardware costs, I think, is one of the biggest aspects I saw emerge out of this. Being a VMware certified person, I know that hardware costs can be saved in it depending on the infrastructure. If you buy a $500,000 infrastructure when you're buying $25,000 servers, over time, you're certainly going to save a lot of money. Disaster recovery and business continuity, high availability, all very important situations and all very important to have in any type of virtualization or cloud services infrastructure. This again was something that came up, and I actually saw this more, of course, on the virtualized experts than I did the physicians, but I did have a few physicians talk about in round three, again, the availability of data. And that means that no matter what happens, we have a hospital outage, we have power outage or environmental issues, that data should always be available. And so I kind of merged that in. And when I saw this occurring into the high availability, that's why I had put that in parentheses. Increased redundancy through multi-host environments and high availability. These themes just kept going over and over and over, multitude at a time. So I found that round three really provided a lot of the relationship information I was looking for between what virtualization or cloud computing can do and the impact on the healthcare of patients. Implications of the study: virtualization provides reliable, expedient data for physicians. That was the number one thing in the very first questions that a lot of the physicians wanted to see, is they wanted to have availability and quickness of data. In some virtualized environments, depending on the type of hardware that's used, it could actually slow some things down. It could be the switches, the firewalls, it could be the internet. Certain things could slow down the way that the data is given to the doctors and physicians. So they needed to have fast data that is actually analyzed quickly to be more responsive in diagnoses and much quicker processes and procedures. Physicians can provide diagnosis more quickly. Medical facility leadership are more informed of the advantages. This was the big thing. I could have all the physicians in the world agree that virtualization and cloud computing is key to their medical future when it comes to patient care. But if the medical CEO and the C-level leadership team didn't buy into it, they weren't really going to go anywhere. Now, I know the doctors and physicians, they typically have a good influence on the medical, but certainly it takes the C-level leadership team to buy into that, to move that vessel forward. The benefits of virtualization include high availability and so many other things we've talked about. The expert panel members affirmed that medical facilities would benefit from virtualization. However, the complexity of administration is greater. And so that was one of the biggest concerns that came out of this was, okay, as I mentioned in a previous slide, we can implement a virtualization, cloud computing, all that we want, But what it's going to take is going to take a complex group of IT professionals that are very certified or knowledgeable in these areas. Now, in many instances, when you're talking cloud computing services, it's with an offsite vendor. Therefore, you actually purchase, if you will, their expertise to help manage that to a certain degree, but it kind of depends, like a Google environment or Amazon environment or what have you. So it really depends on how you implement it, what you're spending on, and if it's virtual, internal, or in the cloud. Some conclusions about this, the significance of the study and the theory and the leadership. One of the things I want to take out of this are the last two items. With this study, it has opened up a lot of discussions I've had and are currently having with hospitals. And a lot of the hospital leadership I'm on conference calls with, talking about how is it that we can take their environment to the next level. I'm very glad to see some larger conglomerate hospitals, some of the largest ones in the world here in the US, that have already gone down this path. And I've actually advised on some of their projects and some of their implementations. But what's most important, I think, that's coming out of this is I believe the leadership of these hospitals have the ability to make better informed decisions, knowing that cloud computing and virtualization is going to not only increase the availability of the data, but increase the ability of that data to be diagnosed much more quickly. And we'll talk about that in just a moment as I've partnered with some other studies. And finally, the practice. This research study is significant in the practice of medical informatics because, again, like the leadership team, this is going to help the physicians in their diagnosis. It's going to be more reliable. I mean, think about you going to a hospital and God forbid there's a surgery that's needed and you're laying there on the table. You're out, of course, but what if the data that they need to make the right incisions been delayed or not available? So the purpose and the significance of this study is great. And it certainly has given the visibility from other organizations. Some conclusions, a lot of information's come out of this and a lot of new areas. What I found was in my literature review and searching over many hundreds of articles and research and talking to professionals, that the findings did certainly align with what I was expecting in a lot of ways. It was non-biased, it certainly was controlled, but knowing my background in virtualization, I really wanted to see how the hospital physicians and the medical professionals responded to this. Financial and manufacturing fields is another big area. Now the talk is big data, right? Artificial intelligence. And that's what is actually in the next steps here that I'm working on now, is how do we take these large amounts and chunks of data, like for example, IBM's Dr. Watson, and how do we get machine learning involved to where it takes these huge amounts of data, this big data, and not just traversing the network, which is one issue, but also how do we get it through the processing power so much more quickly in order to make more defined, informed, and quicker decisions. So big data and artificial intelligence, or Internet of Things, as many call them, but they're not quite the same, but they're close. There's a lot of that going on right now, and there's certainly a lot of room for research in these areas. In particular, the big data. I'm excited to see what our future has for big data, what it means on how we can get more data across networks and through our processing power to make better informed decisions. Expert systems, absolutely. Of course, you get these big data, you've got artificial intelligence, you have to have the systems to interpret it, right? Like I mentioned, the IBM Dr. Watson. Well, the expert systems will continue to evolve. I don't think that's going to stop anytime soon, because as more data we pump through this, the better. For example, the radiology software that I was working in, one patient could have 1,500 pictures of their radiology images being taken. In a cardiovascular study, you could have 400 or 500 pictures of your heart or vascular area. And so those images that are now 3D in color, they take up massive amounts of space. You take 1,500 pictures per patient and they see maybe 100 patients a day on average. It depends on the hospital, of course. That's a lot of data to have to house and traverse the network, and for smart systems to have to crunch and make diagnoses. In fact, one of the organizations that I worked for actually has a new product that's out to where by the time that those images are created, the time that they're taken, regardless if it's radiology or cardiology, before the physician has their own hands per se on that data, the smart computer or system has already diagnosed the patient for them. Now, naturally, the FDA doesn't allow that to be the final diagnosis, which is why the physicians have to really review it. But can you imagine having your data examined and diagnosed by a computer, especially with the evolving on how well medical informatics has evolved over the years and will continue to evolve? That's amazing. Not only the 3D, but the fact that those images are now scanned and it's looked at for abnormalities. And by the time the physician logs into the system, all they have to do is look at the diagnoses and agree or not. It's absolutely amazing. And finally, study the relationship of software virtualization on data mining. Data mining manages large amounts of data. All of these aspects work together: big data, artificial intelligence, expert systems, and data mining. And when data mining, when you talk about the emergence of data and how that data is crunched and how it's represented, there's mass amount of opportunities that come out of that. As more data requirements emerge, systems will need to consistently increase computing power and efficiency. You know, that's, some will say that's a no-brainer, but think about it. There's only so much and so fast a car can drive, right, before it puts out. So we want to make sure that we build systems who can continue to grow and crunch that data in a way that it will always be available for our physicians to get proper diagnoses. The reflection on this process, the research process was enlightening. It had lots of new information around it. It certainly had a lot of new information that I hadn't discovered before. The research process was plenty and full of trial and error, certainly a lot of that going on. What has occurred with this research and where is it going? I've had the opportunity not just today to speak with you, but also publish in journals. I had the opportunity to speak at the National Institute of Health in front of the Commerce Secretary in Washington, D.C., because they are now taking notice on how this type of research can open up opportunities to create a method that's going to help us to have better healthcare because of data availability and reliability. The data integrity needs to be there for people to rely on and know that this data is certainly part of the necessity for good healthcare. It leads into other opportunities with hospitals. As I mentioned, I've been on multiple phone calls and conference calls and visited some hospitals across the nation that has allowed me to participate in some projects or to give them advice on projects on how do we implement this in a way that we know that we're going to win this battle to increase the availability of data and the healthcare of our patients, of the patients. I've had some excellent conversations with some of the most renowned physicians and leaders in hospitals in the entire country. In fact, a friend of mine is the CEO. She's one of the most well-known CEOs of one of the largest healthcare organizations in the country. And I've spent oodles of time talking with her about it and partnering with her. It's been such a blessing. Study, I also would like to and have been a part of some other studies as well. I'm working on a study right now about big data and data science. Big data and data science are going to keep growing. And so I'm working on some ideas and I'm working on research around how is it that this big data can appropriately traverse the network or, be processed in ways that it's going to be easy for that data to have outcomes and to have recognition for what it's worth. Data science is ever growing, and especially expert systems. Currently, I teach some dissertation classes at the University of the Cumberlands, and many of my students are doing artificial intelligence or expert systems. And I love reading about those because I think that's given the way of so much more in the studies, so many more things we can do with expert systems. As I mentioned, mentoring with hospitals, and I don't want to think just the hospitals themselves because there's different types of hospitals, right? This is Mental Health Awareness Month, and I think there's a lot that we can do in the mental health arena as well, and how we can actually get more information and provide better health for mental health patients, and also partnering with and joining other research opportunities, as I mentioned. I'm open to that and would love to do that, and certainly I'm working in some of those areas as we speak now. Okay, so I think I've ended a little short today, and my apologies, but I think you've got about a half an hour back to your day. But I certainly want to open this up to any questions or comments, and my contact information is below. So please feel free to email me if you have any questions, and I'll be happy to take those.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramsey. That is just fascinating research. It's so important. And Dr. Francia and both of your research that you guys have conducted is just pertinent and so important for what we do. And we appreciate you presenting at our Tech Talk this month. So if you have any questions for Dr. Ramsey, please post your questions in the chat. So Dr. Ramsey, let's give it one moment for folks to put their questions in the chat. It looks like you already have one from Patrick Frank. I'll read it for you. Just to clarify something, the virtualization here was on the server side, right? Whether to host their multiple user apps on a virtualization server with that kind of redundancy or based in the cloud. But in both cases, there's still a piece of a quote client software installed on the local computer to access the service, right?
Yes, actually, Patrick, thank you very much for that. So we had I saw and dealt with hospitals that had various different types of implementation. The first was single server. That's where they were going wrong. They thought, wow, I'm not talking virtualization. I'm talking just a single hardware server with maybe a RAID disk installed or something of that sort or connected. And that's what they were using. But they didn't realize that they were more at risk with that type of infrastructure than having a multi-host virtual environment on site. So the conversations always started about what they had internal first and where they could take it to the next steps. But you're absolutely right. A lot of the organizations always opted for internal virtualization, even though cloud virtualization or cloud computing services were permitted and allowed by the FDA. So again, it's because I don't house that internal, therefore I can't touch that data, right? So a lot of organizations were afraid that they couldn't control their own data if it's out there in the cloud. So absolutely.
All right, we have another question for you, Dr. Ramsey. Seems like it's outside the scope of your work, but what's your perception of how much HIPAA's constraints and complexities influence respondents' opinions of virtualization?
Actually, I was curious about that as well, Dr. Zuger. When I was speaking to some of the experts that I had on my panel, we did not talk specifically about patient data. And that was the important thing. We could not do that because HIPAA required the security around that data. What we basically only talked about is the kinds of data. Not necessarily it's your medical records or their medical records, but I don't believe that HIPAA had any constraints around made it in the more or less complex with the type of data. I don't think it had an influence whatsoever. I hope I answer your question.
All right, Dr. Ramsey, another question for you. Great job, Dr. Ramsey. Very interesting information and a topic of growing importance. In a related topic, have you come across research related to contract language between cloud service providers and their customers to define cybersecurity controls and responsibilities of each party?
Absolutely, absolutely, Michael. There are so many ways that we write our contracts. In fact, one of the specialties that I like to do is get in those contracts and look at the responsibilities and what type of cyber controls are in place. And actually, I'm currently working on a lot of cybersecurity certifications and working through some other aspects for the technical side of that. But when you're dealing with these hospitals and if it's cloud computing services specifically, understanding their service level agreement, what their expectations are, how they're going to help you with this security of the data, because a lot of the hospitals thought, and this is where I was really surprised, that if I go out and I grab Amazon, for example, as my cloud computing service, that they're responsible for the security of my data. Okay. How much more wrong could that be, right? It's an equal responsibility, not just for them, but why not have internal controls and monitoring in place and internal processes for auditing to ensure that you don't have some rogue hacking going on or some things going on that they shouldn't. So I absolutely believe that there's big information that's in contracts and should continue to be part of contracts to control that cybersecurity concerns and risks outside of the normal realm. Does that make sense? Does that help? These are excellent questions. Thank you very much.
They're great questions.
All right. Well, listen, I thank everybody so much for your time today. Lauren, it's been such a pleasure. I thank you and the CAE team for this opportunity. And again, my contact information is on the screen. If you would like to have more details or you'd like to have a really cool researcher on any of your projects, why don't you give me a shout? I'll be happy to help.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Dr. Ramsey and Dr. Francia. Great day today, I think, for our May Tech Talk. Would like to thank James Sofer from Capital Technology University for hosting us today. And this concludes our spring 2021 Tech Talks, but be on the lookout for an announcement coming out in the coming weeks for our fall 2021 forum and Tech Talks. If you'd like to present on any of your research, feel free to send us an email and we will get you scheduled for fall 2021, which will begin in September. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great summer and stay safe.